We are very glad that you're able to join us today. With the Reg BI regulations now in effect, we're delighted that you're joining our webinar to talk about the day 2 strategies and implementation considerations. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement at all times, and questions are welcome. So please send a message to our host, to the host option, with your questions, and we'll address them at the end of today's session. And as you can probably tell, we are all working from home today. So apologies in advance if you hear any background noise, dogs barking, or babies crying. Lastly, following today's webinar, we'll be sending out a short survey to hear your feedback. And in the spirit of doing our part, we will be donating $25 for every survey response to the Direct Relief Charity. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? With Reg BI now in effect, broker-dealers have taken many steps to achieve varying degrees of compliance. While there has been ample time and regulatory guidance to mitigate the implementation challenges, sustained compliance gaps still exist, and that's why we're here today. Today, we're going to focus on what broker-dealers and their compliance teams should expect from the pending Reg BI regulatory examinations. We're going to talk about some of the key approaches that have been taken to date from a Reg BI requirement perspective. And then we're going to talk about the remaining gray areas to ensure that firms are ready from a compliance perspective and to adhere to the Reg BI rules. Lastly, we'll provide a brief overview of our compliance platform and how it can help address some of the Reg BI compliance gaps. And then we'll finish off and address any questions that come about through today's session. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be your host today. My name is Param Nasseri, VP of Regulatory Strategy at InvestorCOM. And with me today are Tom Selman, CFA. Tom has over 2 decades of regulatory leadership expertise. Tom served as FINRA's Executive Vice President for Regulatory Policy and its Legal Compliance Officer. Tom's a prolific author, commentator, and expert in financial services regulation, and he's led FINRA's departments, many of FINRA's departments, including his Department of Advertising Regulation, Department of Corporate Financing, and the Office of Disciplinary Affairs, and Office of Financial Innovation. Mr. Selman holds a CFA charter. We also have Scott Critchfield. In his 30+ years of experience, Scott has worked with over 12,000 financial advisors and nearly 2,000 branch managers and executive leaders. Scott earned his CFP designation in 1995, and he has been a 3-time industry speaker on coaching for improved performance at the Security Institute held at the Wharton School of Business. We also have Ben Weston, who's the Chief Compliance Officer of Regal Financial Group. Ben graduated from Michigan State University in 2010 with a bachelor's degree in economics. He spent the next 3 years volunteering at the AmeriCorps in multiple states before ultimately entering the financial services industry, where he joined the Regal's compliance team in 2017 after working for Morgan Stanley as a private banking advisory associate. And we also have David Reeves, CEO of InvestorCOM, and David has spent his career delivering high-impact technology solutions for the financial services sector. Starting out at IBM, David worked with leading global FIs on technology and outsourcing strategy, and David founded InvestorCOM to focus on delivering high-value, intuitive solutions that eliminate compliance risk for the wealth management industry. In addition to leading InvestorCOM, David chairs the Outward Bound Canada and is a past board member of Pathways to Education and YPO. Finally, we've got Dave Carpree, VP of Product and Marketing at InvestorCOM, who will be providing a short technology overview near the end of today's session. Okay, so let's get started. With the Reg BI implementation deadline behind us now, what we've come to learn is that what works for one firm might not necessarily work for another. And in many areas of the regulation, these principle-based rules have specific requirements and gives broker-dealers the flexibility to make decisions that best suit their unique business model. So let's start here. And with this perspective in mind, Tom, as a former regulator, could you share some insights into what the SEC and FINRA will focus on during their examinations?
Sure, thanks, Param. That's a very good question. The SEC has said, and FINRA has also said, that they expect, at least in the first year being 2020, good faith implementation by firms. FINRA has indicated that it would provide observations about Reg BI, but only in the course of their normal cycle exams. So they are not expected to do Reg BI sweeps, and certainly not sweeps in which they would do written exam reports. The SEC is doing a Reg BI sweep, which follows on a risk alert that they had issued in April when they mentioned the good faith implementation. And they also attached an appendix to the April risk alert, which lists a whole bunch of documents that they may request. It appears that their exams are requesting those, or sweep exams are requesting those. I think to get to the fundamental question you're raising, what are the key things that firms should do? I published a piece earlier this year that actually had a target with circles, concentric circles. In the inner circle, I colored orange, bright orange, because those were the things that you really had to do. And then so you left the center and moved out, they were lighter shades because those are things that were still important, but less concerning to me, at least. And I think every firm is doing a similar exercise leading up to June 30th. Some of the things I think they're just obvious are, first of all, make sure that the use of advisor is correctly titled throughout the firm. FINRA staff has said explicitly that they will look at that issue. Make sure you have proof that the relationship summaries were delivered to the customers. Make sure that your WSPs are complete. They may not be perfect. You may get comments on them, but they should reflect all of the issues in Reg BI and Form CRS. And don't make dumb mistakes. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal recently did a study of firms' disclosure of disciplinary histories and found that a shocking number of firms either didn't disclose their disciplinary history at all, or perhaps worse, said that there was no history when their filings with the SEC indicated that they did have history. So don't do, obviously, silly things like that.
Thanks, Tom. That's very insightful. So considering each of Reg BI's 4 regulatory pillars, we're curious to know what varied approaches are firms taking to achieve compliance. Ben and Scott, could you share your observations with respect to the Reg BI implementation? What are some actions that to date that you've observed that have been taking place in your respective organizations? Let me start with Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Param. Appreciate being asked to join you all. And I can't speak directly to what Ellen Reed's regulations are and policies are. I'm not their spokesman on that. But as I support over 200 advisors for the firm, I can speak to how the advisors are working in that area. And to that point in your question, what we have found is, it hasn't been that much of a change in their behaviors to what was being put in place when the DOL was being in place. We didn't dump any of what we were working on back then. As a matter of fact, our current president, Sean Mehal, was running that project before he became president and just anticipated that some version of the fiduciary rule was going to come back around. So we did quite a bit of training and regulation processes back then with our advisors. So they were actually prepped and ready to go when the Reg BI came around. I'd say what we have noticed, though, is in the social setting, especially with more of our veteran advisors, when a normal conversation would crop up, say over a beer or a picnic or at a social kind of a function, when the question would come up that, I'm going to be retiring soon, or I've got a 401k, or what's going on with the markets, the normal instinct would just be to go right into a conversation. In today's world with Reg BI and CRS, that's not as instinctual to jump right into the conversation. And as Tom mentioned, it's, there's documentation, there's, other things that have to be taken into account. And in the past, you might have gone right into what you would normally have recommended to somebody, whereas now you have to be a lot more conscious of what you even share with somebody, and go into all four alternatives that might a person consider, or in most instances, advisors are now saying, you know what, let's just set an appointment for next week and have to table the whole conversation in general.
Thanks, Scott. Let me turn it over to Ben. Ben, do you mind sharing sort of the path that you've taken at your firm from a compliance with Reg BI perspective?
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to say, it's great to be here. I'm glad we can get together and do the webinar. I think from our perspective, it's been a large change in how our advisors are conducting and processing some of their business. We've seen a lot more engagement from compliance officer to rep level. We're having a lot more conversations with reps about some of the recommendations they're making, why they're in the best interest of the client. We've certainly made updates to our forms so that we're getting some Reg BI specific information from the clients as a part of their sort of onboarding experience. And then, we've certainly engaged with the InvestorCOM team to use things like peer compare when appropriate, as well as the Compliance Express system for the delivery of that form CRS. Overall, I think, like I said, the big thing is us just having a better understanding of why some of these recommendations are coming into play, and why they're in the best interest of the client. Depending on the registration of the advisor, their business model has either changed quite a bit or it really hasn't changed much at all. I will say we're also just sort of lastly, we're getting a lot more client notes, just as a part of our general business processing. We're finding that, any CRM notes that those reps are taking are typically very helpful when we're reviewing some of these transactions.
Thanks, Ben. That's really helpful. Certainly, we've been hearing a lot of commentary around documentation and note taking, and if there's one takeaway from this conversation, I think that's certainly one of them. David, let me turn the mic back to you and say, I'm sure you've been talking to many of our clients. What have you heard in general from a Reg BI implementation perspective?
Well, thank you, Param. Not just clients. I mean, when we speak to clients and I'd say other technology providers, custody clearing firms, and industry experts broadly, I think actually the messages seem to be pretty similar about what's been going on. On June 30th, most focused really on what I would consider to be minimum standards, with few exceptions. I mean, some firms, I think, sort of made more aggressive steps into technology investments, but most firms really looked at, what was required to demonstrate good faith, and with some kind of, I'll call it the most obvious compliance activities, such as the ones that Tom noted earlier, such as Form CRS. So that's, generally speaking, that's really what we've seen so far. And I think I'm speaking for many in the industry that would say, kind of call it that good faith minimum compliance level has been done. I think it's important to share a couple of recent examples. Last week, I was speaking to a large BD that has about 8,000 advisors, and they told me they actually mailed out 1.8 million Form CRS. And so, that's an awfully costly and manual process. Another BD that actually has over 10,000 advisors have implemented a manual process for product selection. So specifically, when you think of the different obligations, specifically care, and the need to analyze reasonably available alternatives, what they're doing is asking advisors to document their product research, which is then peer reviewed for 48 hours. Recommendation gets to their clients. So I probably don't need to tell anyone that these are two examples that are screaming out for technology, both from a cost management standpoint and ultimately, probably from an advisor client success standpoint as well. I mean, speed is important and cost management's important. if you just want to quickly look at that reasonably available alternatives example that I just mentioned, we had a bit of fun, and thanks for putting up this chart. We had a bit of fun analyzing how much data you really do need to consider to come up with an RIA recommendation, whether it be a mutual fund or an ETF or an annuity or other. And in this particular case, large open architecture shelf, in this case, 35,000 products, assuming an advisor is making 5 recommendations each day, and they need to analyze 6 data points in order to really complete a proper analysis. I mean, that's 1 million data points every day. And the human brain requires about 5.5 days to do that work. And technology, Peer Compare and other tech solutions process this in under 5 seconds. So, clearly there are sort of call it good faith efforts that were made June 30th. And now, more and more broker dealers are looking at how do we automate these tasks and ultimately, make it simpler for advisors to meet the regulation.
Thanks, David. That's really insightful. And it's a good segue to sort of transition the conversation into sort of what should be the priorities as we go into the second phase or this day 2 phase of Reg BI. Let's talk about a little bit about this notion and what firms in a post-Reg BI world should expect from regulatory examinations. What are some of the common gray areas and how should firms best deal with it post-deadline? One good way to look into this to the future is to sort of look at what the regulatory expectations are. And Tom, well, there's been this anonymized examination request with a ton of questions and information that's being requested. It's floating out there in the internet world. I wonder if you have any insights to share from that perspective. What do you believe to be the key gray areas for firms? Tom, you're on mute.
I guess there are 2 parts to the answer. The first is just what does this letter mean, the letter I referred to, the sweep letter, because it does require a huge amount of information. It requires, for example, a description of all the accounts, all fees and charges to the retail customers, all marketing material, even transactions occurring the year before Reg BI was implemented. So there's a huge amount of information that the SEC is asking even in its initial sweeps. And the question, as I mentioned before, is whether the SEC is still going to take a good faith implementation to Reg BI, maybe make oral comments to firms, or whether they're going to actually take all this data, which is quite burdensome to firms to gather, and make written reports. Having said all that, I think there are a lot of areas that require clarity. The SEC has established a committee internally to look at Form CRS compliance. They said they're going to try to meet in the fall, I believe, sometime, which we're in now. Apparently because they have some concerns with how the relationship summaries were drafted. Maybe that some of that reflects what the Wall Street Journal found, for example, some obvious gaps. Although you wouldn't think you'd need a staff committee to deal with that. But in any event, there are some issues with Form CRS they're referring to. There are 3 other issues I think some firms probably are dealing with, which is, first of all, the whole question of ongoing monitoring of accounts, making clear to customers when they're not going to monitor, when they may just do a occasional review, and what it means to monitor, and how you make sure reps know that if they're monitoring that they have to be careful about hold recommendations, for example. The second issue is, what does it mean to mitigate conflicts, particularly at the rep level, and to make sure that those conflicts continue to be mitigated. So if new conflicts arise, that the mitigation occurs. The staff is really unclear, the release is really unclear about what they mean by mitigation. They use different terms to refer to mitigation. And the third has to do with the issue that you raised, which is the consideration of reasonable alternatives. What does that actually mean for firms? What is the extent to which the reasonable alternatives have to be considered? What is the category? And all this, I should summarize by saying, is subject to different approaches depending on who wins the election in the US. So those are at least 3, I think, significant interpretive issues.
Thanks, Tom. Certainly a good way to kind of look out into the future and help firm prioritize, especially with the election in the forefront. Scott, let me turn it over to you. As you coach advisors and work with advisors, what do you believe to be their single biggest challenge, and really what should be the priority from an advisor perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say, from my early observations, the biggest challenge is the documentation. When you consider the number of conversations that an advisor has, not only with clients, but with prospects, day in, day out, as Tom alluded to, especially in the last few months on the market volatility, just on having hold conversations. In the past, those weren't usually conversations that you made documentation of, other than just to note, I had a conversation with Dave. But to get into the detail that you need to note, we had a conversation about his IRA, we had a conversation about his 401k, and the conversation was to stick with the plan, the conversation was to change this, change that. Those weren't things in the past that an advisor had to go into detail, that they had to be concerned with, had to be readily available for an auditor to see and have timestamps. And, in my example, in one office I support, I've got 3 individuals over the age of 80 that will point you to a file box full of legal pads. And, in today's world, that's not necessarily compliant, other than, to say they took a note. But, when you consider the fact it needs to be time stamped and unable to be edited in the future, that puts them at a disadvantage. So technology is going to be a big advantage for those individuals to be able to use their CRMs, or in a situation like you're presenting here, to be able to make a note that a conversation was had in that particular area.
Thanks, Scott. I think your point about the hold recommendation is a good one, because that is actually the anonymized letter of that's being asked from the dealer's perspective. Show us how you're dealing with the hold recommendation question.
Yeah, we've had 3 webinars in the last 6 weeks on that topic alone, making sure that advisors knew that by just handling a client and talking them, quote unquote, off the ledge, just to stick with the plan, everything's okay, nothing has changed on the fundamentals of the investments, that it's just market volatility, as per usual, but that counts as a recommendation. Doesn't necessarily require a Reg BI or CRS, because there's no material changes that are occurring, but it's still considered a recommendation.
Right. Thanks, Scott. Let me turn it over to Ben. You talked a little bit about sort of the fact that your firms developed some technology to address the Reg BI's care obligation and disclosure obligation. What are your plans moving forward? How are you going to prioritize those steps?
We're just going to keep training our advisors. Make sure that, Tom is talking about, these examination letters, make sure that we're sharing that information with the field, that, here's what can be expected. Here's why we're asking some of the things that we're asking. I said before, we've seen a lot more engagement with our compliance officers with the actual reps. So I expect that to continue. We're certainly going to continue to put out webinars and video resources on a lot of this new Reg BI stuff. And then based on the feedback that we receive from the SEC through our own examination or things that we're seeing from their releases, we're certainly going to have to adapt. I think the point on CRM technology and being able to have client notes, I think that's just going to become one of the more important things for any advisor, is making sure that any conversation they're having with the client is documented, readily available. I know the notepad thing is something that we're dealing with now, to where, sometimes we'll ask for client notes from a rep, and then they'll just upload a picture of some notes they took on a legal pad or something. So starting to change the culture and sort of business practices of those reps to direct them to something that's a little bit more concrete, something that's going to be, it's going to hold up for them longer term.
Thanks, Ben. I think that's another takeaway for our audience today. Avoid that legal notepad from a practice perspective. David, let me switch it over to you. Going back to sort of the discussions with folks in the industry, what do you believe to be the key priorities as we sort of march ahead?
I think that a big priority, maybe it's number one or it's certainly top three, and, witness the number of folks on the webinar today. I think there's still a major priority to understand what Reg BI is and, in all of its different, different, 4 pillars. And of course, there's many layers within those pillars. Just like many regulations, I think, in the kind of Western world in financial services, it's principle-based, which for sure can create a bit of industry confusion. I think there's some opportunity, but the challenge is for sure confusion, because it's not a highly prescriptive, you must do the following, 10 things to comply. I think, some of the simpler aspects are very clear, but the care obligation, as you know, Param, our clients, we're having lots of conversations around what exactly needs to be done on that, including a chat this morning with a client. I think many broker dealers are waiting to see what the SEC FINRA exams yield. And, I think the view is hopefully that will clarify their day 2 steps. And, we'll just kind of hopefully chart a more clear path for them. I think priority number 2 is the ability to comply. There's no question that COVID has knocked every firm's priorities back. I mean, not just in wealth and all, in any industry, in any part of the world. And so, I think we also have to remember we're only 6 months into COVID and actually only 76 days past June 30th. So, firms are starting to get used to this new normal in our view, and we see actually a pretty significant spike in, I'd say, Reg BI conversations, proposals, pilots, engagements. So I think that this notion of the ability to comply is starting to loosen, which I think is a good thing.
Thanks, David. Let me now turn it over to Dave Carpri, who's going to provide us with a technology overview. I'll stop sharing, Dave.
Thanks, Param. So I will share my screen here. And so just want to give you a quick highlight. We won't do, yeah, you're seeing my screen now?
Yep.
Good. Obviously, we won't have time for a full product demo, which we'd gladly provide to anyone on the call here that would like to. But really want to focus on a couple of key aspects from our compliance products that I think connect some of the dots that we've been talking about today, from the how do you consider all these data points to assess reasonable alternatives, right through that record keeping challenge, and how that whole recommendation process, how to enable that and apply technology to it to solve some of those challenges. And for starters, I'll show you our peer compare product. And important to note, what drives this is an engine that every night ingests. I mean, David talked about 1 million data points that an advisor needs to consider. We look at 50 to 80 million every night to build the database, which is essentially the universe of products with understanding what all the changes are and what they look like. And then the one, I'll say, client-focused overlay to that is, what are the products you make available to your reps and advisors? So what is your product shelf? And then from that, it's ready to go. And so I'll start off with a quick example here, and I'll pull up a particular fund and then explain what just happened on the screen here. So our peer compare product, the concept is really around, when you think of that, the care obligation and the consideration of reasonable alternatives, we're putting together this concept called a peer group. And so when I started with this American funds, American mutual fund that I looked up, what we've done is we've gone into our database and pulled out all comparable products on the shelf, so filtered on that shelf. So as I'll walk through the screen here, we can see the shelf we're using for demo purposes is a large shelf, just over 27,000 total products on that shelf. And we've found 153 mutual funds that match this American funds mutual fund. And what does matching mean? What does a peer group mean? Well, it means they're all of the same product type, so mutual fund. They're a US equity asset class, they're a large value category, and they're a share class A. So that's really about how to define that peer group to consider alternatives or to find those alternatives. Then, and once they've been defined, then we transition to the consideration. And So we pulled back, these are the 153 alternatives, but then measured up against 3 key dimensions. So cost, risk, and performance. And we can see visually, you can scroll through the alternatives on your shelf to see how they stack up. At the bottom here, there's some summary information around low, median, and high on that particular dimension in this peer group. So you've got an idea of how this product stands up versus its peers. And ultimately, drilling down really paints a snapshot of that, I'll say, recommendation, or the recommendation that's about to happen, which isolates the recommendation of the American funds product here and says versus its peers. We can see on the cost side, it's relatively cost effective. Using a 3-year standard deviation, it's exhibited less risk than its peers. And if we look at the performance perspective on a 3-year trailing return, it's above average versus its peers. And so this is really that product, or peer compares the experience that the rep or the advisor is really going through to understand her shelf, to understand a bit more about what those alternatives are. In this case, if she said there's something about this fund that maybe I want to consider something else, most advisors tend to have their favorites and always go to their go-to products. Going back to their peer group allows them to take a look at what else is on that shelf. Important here is that, Scott, you had talked about those conversations that they have at picnics on the golf course, etc. So peer compare isn't about telling you which product is the right one and which one is the best one. So we're leaving that in the hands of the advisor. Her job is to make sure she recommends the products best suited for where there's a lot of factors at play. What this really does is provide that context, the backdrop in which the recommendation needs to stand up. So I'm planning on making this recommendation for these reasons.
Yeah, and Dave, building on that thought, the thing that jumps out at me about this is you're able, if I'm correct, able to capture this research that you did to document it for purposes. And I think that's the piece, as a coach, that I think advisors struggle with. They can say that I looked at this fund, this fund, this fund, but it's kind of like, 8th grade math. You have to show the teacher your work. Try to work with my 16-year-old in high school and teach him the math that I used to do versus today's work. I never showed my math anywhere. So, I think this, allows you to capture that without having to go through just reams and reams of pages to show all your notes. That's what jumps out at me about this technology.
Yeah, thanks. And that's really the pivot in peer compare. It goes from the utility to consider your alternatives and making sense of what that actually means to actually the documentation and the record keeping aspect.
Yeah.
So these two areas here, the recommend and the disclose function. Recommend is purely, this isn't for client consumption, but it's for record keeping. So I'll enter create my recommendation. Let's say I'm going to suggest this product to Dave. And I've got my notes and explanations of why I wanted this. And when I complete that recommendation, this is really does the note to the log timestamp with the advisor comments and a snapshot of this artifact. So the context that existed at the time when she made her recommendation. The alternative endpoint here is also a disclose, which does the record keeping in addition to sends this artifact to an investor. So the Compliance Express offers both the disclosure and the record keeping components of that. And so I'll flip over to our Compliance Express platform now. And this really just you can see the background or the platform part that enables record keeping and disclosure across. And so the generic part of Compliance Express is generic disclosure. So in this case, let's say I wanted to do disclosure for, let's say, a form CRS. I'll add that to my delivery. And there are enterprise and advisor specific libraries. So let's go to my specific library where I have in this case, a form ADV2B, which will be personalized to me. and I want to do a delivery of those things. And exactly the same delivery options that we had through the peer compare to do things either email or just purely as a record keeping entry. And in this case, because we want to disclose that form CRS, we're going to actually step through with the delivery of that. And as part of the end step, there's always the opportunity to do a few notes to file. And let's say there's a fee disclosure that you can choose whether it's free form or radio buttons to really guide and control that advisor attestation that guides the record keeping. And then we complete that delivery. Ultimately, I mean, that's really the transactional part of it. When it comes to oversight, it's really about where is that information? Can we pull it out? The examiner comes calling, there's a client complaint and we're launching an investigation and we need to figure out what all happened and when. And that's really where we go to our, this is the advisor view, but there's also obviously an enterprise view that lets you provide surveillance across the whole scope. So in this case, I filtered on all the disclosure activities that I've done with Dave. He's quite a busy client of mine. And I'll go to one that I sent earlier here, just to give you a sense of some of the components of the disclosure or of the record keeping that we've got. When we dip into the journal or the log, we see it a timestamp when it was sent. We can see what documents were sent, if they were opened, if so when, even a link to the document that you could open and see what the investor saw, whether that's a peer compare artifact, a form CRS artifact, it's all in there. And then any notes that we've attached to it. Again, timestamp. So we have the fee disclosure note and the conflicts of interest note. The advisor can add comments after the fact, but again, it's also timestamped as after the fact. So you really have that audit trail of when and where did this happen. So wanted to end it there from just really that record keeping and disclosure and reasonably available alternatives part. The one piece I just want to add before turning it back to Param is as our clients are getting into I'll say the transactional part and starting to look at how do we start adding value? How do we take the information that's sitting in that database to do other things like thinking about I'll say the composition of our product shelf. We have components like our shelf monitor solution, which takes all those changes that we looked at that I mentioned before, and basically is a log of show me everything that changed on my product shelf, which we can filter and sort by asset manager, by fund name, by date, and say what are material changes, and really surfacing those important changes back. And the last thing I'll just very quickly slide onto the screen, which takes the powerful concept of the peer compare artifact that says, how do I rank and stack up versus my peers? Through our onboarding, a lot of our clients are asking for a bit of a shelf health check, where we take, I'll just pull up the version of the report here, where we step through all the peer groups on their shelf and do an assessment of what percentile on cost, risk, performance do all my products stack up. And this one here, we chose to sort by kind of the reds, which is the worst quartile. The greens are the best quartile. And you can kind of see, what does my shelf look like? How does it stack up relative to itself? So when you think of, does my shelf and the products that we make available to our clients really represent a best interest shelf? It's really providing tools that can allow that. So I will end it there, Parm. I know I'm conscious of time here, but I'll turn it over to you for some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave, for that lightning round of product overview. I'm just going to reshare my screen and open the floor for questions. We've got a couple floating around. Let's start with a question from Kathleen, and she's asking, does your compliance reporting system integrate with CRM systems? Basically, she's outlined Redtail and I believe Salesforce. from a documentation consolidation perspective. Dave Carpri, can I float this to you?
You bet, you bet. So I'll pick that one up. So yes, we integrate with CRM systems through a number of ways, directly through APIs as product integration, but also kind of on batch asynchronous updates, and both ways. So are we going to be the record keeper that are bringing in transactions from other systems, or the contacts and prospects from Redtail?
Thank you, Dave. I've got two more questions in the queue. Tom, one's for you. Get ready. So Tom, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal article around sort of some of the disclosure challenges for the Form CRS. Would this potentially be considered enforceable matters?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of thing that basically, if I were a firm, I would expect a minimum of a written write-up by OC and FINRA, or an enforcement referral. Maybe from the article, it seemed to me it'd be a mass case, a case with multiple respondents by SEC.
Thanks, Don. Okay, Dave, this one possibly for you, or I can tackle it. In the reasonably available analysis segment, what's the difference between the notion of a peer group and a fund head-to-head analysis?
Okay, yeah, I'll tackle that. That's a great question. The difference on the peer group versus the head-to-head is partly a matter of process, consistency, and the ability to provide oversight on that process. So in a head-to-head, an advisor is typically choosing the products she wants to do a runoff against. If she's done her homework, she knows exactly what the outcome is. There's no, I mean, not that there should be mystery, but the outcome is clear. And it's also difficult to understand which products, from a surveillance and oversight perspective, which products are being chosen. What a peer group does is it doesn't provide the depth that a head-to-head might, but it really provides that backdrop to say, at a BD level, we decide how the peer group is defined, and then everyone going through the RAA process is using that same criteria, and is making their recommendations against that backdrop. So now we have consistency and something that's kind of a decent set that's less subjective.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. This one might be directed to you as well, so thanks for joining today's call. How are you documenting Form CRS/ADV3 delivery if you don't have a CRM system? Did I freeze?
No, Parm, were you firing that to me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I missed that. Yeah, so a couple of things. So we do have, when we say who this, or when we tag it to an individual, we are able to introduce external identifiers. If we're syncing with the CRM system, we have that built into the address. We also have the identifiers so they can match up. Reality is, though, some of these documents, the disclosure aspects happen before the account is set up. So often these prospects aren't in the CRM system yet, and so we're able to capture it within Compliance Express for record-keeping purposes, and then ideally sync it later on once they have a client ID.
Thanks, Dave. In the interest of time, let's just take up one more question. When doing a peer group comparison, if the fund you want to recommend doesn't stack up well in the three categories of risk, cost, and performance, can you get a list of products that rank better?
Yeah, and so not sure if you saw that when you scroll through your peer group, you're able to sort and filter by really any of the fields there. So we don't have kind of the aggregate, what's best, what's worst, but you're able to sort on all the dimensions. You can say ascending or descending performance, risk, or cost.
Thanks, Dave. I know we're 1 minute ahead of sort of the end of our session. I want to end off by thanking everyone for attending today's session, and a big thank you to our guests in Scott, Tom, and Ben for making today a great and very informative session. Thank you all.
Thanks, Param.